Millions of viewers witnessed the moment Jasmine Crockett transformed from questioner to prosecutor, unleashing a torrent of dates, documents, and dollar figures that left Melania Trump visibly shaken before a live national audience. The first detail that struck viewers wasn't the gleaming studio lights or the pristine set design. It was how Congresswoman Crockett positioned herself in her chair, leaning forward with predatory focus, her hands poised like a chess master about to execute checkmate, eyes locked onto the First Lady as though she'd been rehearsing this confrontation for months. This wasn't merely another Sunday evening political roundtable. This was live television stretching from coast to coast, and the stakes hung heavier in the air than anyone on that stage dared acknowledge aloud. The network's premier Sunday night program had promised viewers a spirited discussion on current policy tensions between Congress and the White House. The Washington, D.C. studio gleamed under professional lighting, a crescent-shaped table of polished mahogany, 3 cameras circling like silent predators, and a live audience scattered in shadowy tiers beyond the hot lights. But seasoned political watchers could sense something electric crackling through the atmosphere tonight. Something that transcended typical talking points. Melania Trump occupied the far end of the curved table, draped in an ivory blazer with razor-sharp shoulders, her hair swept back in perfect symmetry. She embodied composure itself, yet observant viewers might have noticed her fingers interlaced just slightly too tightly in her lap. Jasmine, meanwhile, commanded attention in a deep cobalt blazer that seemed to draw every camera lens toward her like a magnet. She radiated calm, but beneath the surface ran an undercurrent of quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to announce its presence because it already owns the room. Veteran anchor Paul Whitfield began with his trademark pleasantries, introducing each guest in that polished baritone that somehow makes even tension sound civilized. On paper, the lineup appeared balanced. Jasmine Crockett, Democratic Congresswoman from Texas. Melania Trump, still serving as First Lady following Donald Trump's narrow re-election victory. And political commentator Roland Chase providing analysis. But anyone who followed the news cycle knew this wasn't an even match. Jasmine had been making headlines with her unflinching style and her refusal to soften her attacks on powerful figures. And tonight she sat mere feet away from one of America's most protected women. Paul launched the discussion with standard political fare: immigration reform, education funding, international trade agreements. Jasmine responded with surgical precision, weaving facts into every statement like a prosecutor building a case. Melania countered with carefully calibrated language, adhering to White House-approved talking points. The exchange felt routine, almost scripted, until it didn't. From the secondary camera angle, viewers could observe Jasmine's occasional glances toward a slim folder positioned just beyond her notes. She hadn't touched it yet, but her fingers occasionally grazed its edge, as if reminding herself of its presence. The audience remained unaware, but inside that folder lay the reason this broadcast would be replayed thousands of times over the next 24 hours. The studio's energy shifted palpably when Paul posed a pointed question about transparency in public office, a subject upon which Jasmine had built her entire career. She smiled, but not in a way that diffused the mounting tension. "Well, Paul," Jasmine began, her voice carrying the weight of impending revelation, "I believe transparency applies to every person who represents this country, elected officials, appointed leaders, and yes, even those who reside in the White House." A silence followed. Melania's head turned almost imperceptibly toward Jasmine, her expression maintaining its neutrality while her eyes sharpened with newfound focus. Jasmine didn't pounce immediately. She allowed the silence to breathe, letting that single sentence settle into the consciousness of millions of viewers before continuing, her tone remaining even as if discussing a mundane budget bill. Because if the American people cannot trust that their leaders, or their leaders' families, are being honest about their conduct, then every speech, every promise, every public appearance becomes nothing more than theater. Paul shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing the trajectory of the conversation. Melania responded, her accent soft but her words carrying steel. "I think it's important not to make personal accusations when we are here to discuss policy, Congresswoman." Jasmine offered the faintest smile. "Oh, I completely agree, which is precisely why I prefer to base my statements on evidence." Roland Chase, the third panelist, settled back in his seat with a knowing smirk. He'd moderated enough of these broadcasts to recognize when the temperature was about to spike, and the truth was, it had already begun. Jasmine's hand now rested fully on the folder, and while she didn't open it, everyone watching understood it was only a matter of time. The live audience leaned forward collectively. Viewers at home were already flooding social media with observations about the tension crackling between the two women. The camera briefly captured Melania crossing one leg over the other and adjusting her jacket sleeve. A subtle movement, but the kind of detail people notice when they're searching for signs of discomfort. The panel discussion officially remained focused on policy, but the atmosphere had undergone a complete transformation. You could feel it in Paul's throat clearing before transitioning to the next topic, as if attempting to navigate the conversation back into safer waters. But Jasmine had no intention of allowing it to remain there. The moment Paul attempted to pivot to his next question, Jasmine glanced at him briefly, then returned her gaze to Melania, silently signaling she wasn't finished. The camera's red light remained fixed on her, capturing that fraction of a knowing smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Confident rather than cocky, like someone who knows exactly how the game will end. Melania maintained her regal bearing, her expression almost statuesque. Years of facing cameras had taught her how to maintain that polished barrier, but trained observers could detect the subtle narrowing at the corners of her eyes. Not fear, not yet, but a quiet bracing for what might come. "First Lady Trump," Paul addressed her, "you've been very vocal about the administration's efforts on education reform. How do you respond to critics who say—" "I respond," she interrupted smoothly, "that most critics do not have full understanding of the facts. It is easy to criticize when you do not have responsibility of leading a nation." She concluded her statement looking directly at Jasmine. The glance wasn't accidental. Jasmine leaned back slightly, pausing as if deciding whether to let that pass. Then her eyes flickered downward, almost imperceptibly, to the folder beside her. "I think responsibility," Jasmine said slowly, each word measured, "means being open when there are questions that the public deserves answers to. And I think the American people are smart enough to distinguish between a smear campaign and legitimate concerns. Concerns should be about policy, Congresswoman, not about family matters," Melania replied, her eyes unwavering. Paul jumped in quickly, sensing the air tightening between them. "All right, let's keep this focused on policy for the moment." Roland Chase cut him off with a dry chuckle. "Paul, you can't expect people to separate policy from the people who implement it. If we're discussing trust, then character becomes part of that equation." Melania's head turned sharply toward Roland. She offered a polite, tight-lipped smile, but remained silent. The studio lights seemed to intensify, or perhaps it merely felt that way. The room had grown so still between exchanges that you could hear the faint rustle of papers when Jasmine adjusted her notes, though she never completely removed her gaze from Melania. "You know," Jasmine began, her tone conversational but her focus laser-sharp. "When I came here tonight, I planned to stick to the script, talk about bills, numbers, statistics. But if we're going to discuss trust, we can't pretend that trust begins and ends at the White House gates." Paul's voice carried that familiar, "let's move on" energy, but it was too late. "I think the American people want their representatives to focus on work, not on gossip," Melania said. Jasmine tilted her head, almost as if amused. "You're absolutely right, which is why what I'm discussing isn't gossip." She let that sentence hang in the air just long enough to make Melania blink once, slow, deliberate, before continuing. "It's documented." A murmur rippled through the small live audience. Paul attempted to regain control. Let's give the First Lady a chance to respond before we move forward. Melania's gaze remained steady. I am not aware of anything that needs to be defended. My work is public. My schedule is public. Anything else is private, and I will not respond to rumors. Jasmine's voice didn't rise, but the steel in it became unmistakable. Then I suppose this will be your first opportunity to respond to something that's neither rumor nor speculation. Paul visibly shifted in his chair. Roland's smirk deepened as he leaned slightly forward, like a spectator in the front row of a boxing match. The production crew behind the glass wall likely already knew this segment was destined to trend. If you have something to say, Congresswoman, you should say it plainly, Melania responded. I plan to, Jasmine replied, calm as ever. But when I do, I want it to be very clear to everyone watching that I gave you the opportunity to address it without specifics first. The tension wasn't loud or chaotic. It was the quiet kind where every word feels like it might be the match that ignites the powder keg. In that moment, the audience didn't just want to hear what Jasmine had to say. They needed to. Paul took a breath, glanced between them, and attempted to move the conversation toward an unrelated question about international trade. But neither woman looked away from the other during the first few seconds of his question, as if the words leaving Paul's mouth were merely background noise. The truth was, Jasmine had just set the stage, and she understood that the revelation would hit harder because of this careful build-up. Paul's next question landed somewhere in the realm of international tariffs, but the words barely registered with the audience or the two women locked in this subtle standoff. The tension had already shifted the room's gravitational pull, and everyone could sense it. Jasmine glanced down at her notes, then back at Paul, offering him a polite response that danced along the surface of the topic just enough to sound engaged without derailing her own momentum. She concluded with, "Of course, accountability applies not just to other nations, but to our own leaders as well." It was a subtle needle, but one Melania couldn't ignore. The First Lady straightened in her chair, adjusting her sleeve in that precise way she employed when signaling composure. I think that is why my husband has been very clear about his priorities. He works for the American people every day. And so do I, Jasmine replied with a controlled smile. Which is why when I observe patterns that raise questions, I feel obligated to address them. Public service means providing public answers. Paul attempted to mediate. Congresswoman, are you suggesting there's something that hasn't been disclosed? I'm not suggesting anything, Jasmine replied, her voice calm but deliberate. I'm stating that there are verifiable records that the public has a right to see. Records that connect public actions to personal decisions. And in this case, those decisions impact how the first family is perceived. Melania's jaw shifted ever so slightly, but her voice remained even. I do not think the American people want personal drama to distract from serious work. Personal drama is one thing, Jasmine countered. Patterns that suggest something deeper. That's another matter entirely. Roland leaned back, grinning slightly. Well, now you've got us all curious. What kind of patterns are we talking about? Jasmine glanced at him, then returned her focus to Melania. Let's just say they involve some unusual travel arrangements and financial movements. Nothing that would matter if we weren't discussing the First Lady of the United States. But here we are. The studio air felt heavier now. The audience wasn't making a sound, but the collective focus was locked in like a laser beam. Congresswoman, Paul said, I'm going to have to ask you to clarify that. I will, Jasmine said smoothly, cutting in without raising her voice. But first I think it's only fair to ask the First Lady if she's aware of these records. Melania's lips curved into the kind of smile politicians deploy when deciding whether to counterattack or let something slide. If you are referring to official matters, I am always aware of my schedule and responsibilities. If you are talking about something else, then no, I am not aware. There was a faint emphasis on that final no, that gave everything away. Jasmine caught it, and so did the audience. "Interesting," she said simply, letting the words sit there like a stone dropped into still water. Paul jumped in again. "All right, before we go further into that, let's keep the discussion productive." Roland interrupted, half laughing. "Paul, you can't unring a bell. The Congresswoman just dropped a breadcrumb trail in front of the whole country. I think we all know where this is headed." Melania gave him a look that was polite but glacial. "If people choose to focus on rumors instead of the work we do, that is their choice. I will not encourage it." "That's the thing," Jasmine said, leaning forward just slightly. "This isn't rumor. And the reason it matters is because leadership isn't just about policies on paper. It's about credibility. And credibility can't survive if it's built on secrecy." Paul shuffled his papers, clearly ready to move on. But the control of the conversation had already slipped from his grasp. Jasmine glanced toward the camera now, speaking directly to the millions watching from their living rooms. Every American watching this tonight deserves leaders who are as transparent as they expect ordinary citizens to be. And when leaders choose not to be, it's up to those of us in public service to ensure the truth doesn't stay hidden. She let the moment hang just long enough before looking back at Melania. "Even if that truth makes people uncomfortable." "I am very comfortable with truth, Congresswoman," Melania replied. "Then," Jasmine said evenly, "you'll be comfortable with what comes next." The audience released a low murmur, the kind that escapes when people realize they've just witnessed a turning point. Paul glanced nervously toward the production crew behind the glass. Someone was already scribbling notes to prepare for a commercial break. But the segment was too combustible to cut away from now. The clock above the camera showed several minutes remained in this block. Enough time for Jasmine to drop something substantial before the network went to ads. And she looked like she intended to use every second. But she wasn't going to throw the punch just yet. She wanted the entire room leaning forward before it landed. Jasmine shifted slightly in her chair, letting the folder rest at the edge of her fingertips now, almost like a prop she knew the audience couldn't stop staring at. She didn't open it yet, but her hand remained there, sending a silent message. "This matters." Paul, sensing the tension ratcheting up, tried to redirect with a question to Roland about trade negotiations. Roland gave a quick surface-level answer, but even he kept glancing at Jasmine and Melania like everyone else. The panel's center of gravity had shifted entirely to those two women. Jasmine waited until the exchange died down, then spoke without being prompted. "You know, Paul, when we talk about transparency, I think it's worth mentioning that sometimes transparency doesn't come willingly. Sometimes it requires a push." Melania's eyes flickered toward her, but she didn't move otherwise. Jasmine continued, her tone almost conversational. "In the past month, I've received information, not from anonymous whispers, but from documented sources, that caught my attention. And I'm confident it would catch the public's attention too." The live audience leaned forward almost in unison. Paul exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting between them. "Congresswoman, if this is about a specific allegation, it's about patterns," Jasmine cut in, her voice steady. "Patterns involving travel that doesn't match official schedules, financial transfers routed through accounts not typically used for government purposes, and dates that align with some very curious public appearances." The camera immediately cut to Melania. Her expression didn't break, but her fingers tightened just slightly where they rested on the table. Jasmine kept going. "Now, I'm not here to speculate about the why just yet, but I think the what is important enough to put on the record, especially when the what is backed by receipts." Roland chuckled under his breath. "You're saying you've got proof right there in that folder?" Jasmine tapped the edge of it lightly. "I'm saying I have records that anyone with the right access could verify." Melania finally spoke, her voice cool but sharp. "If you believe there is something inappropriate, there are proper channels for that, Congresswoman. Making accusations on television is not professional. This isn't an accusation, Jasmine replied, her eyes locked on hers. It's an opportunity for you to address it before it takes on a life of its own. That sentence landed like a challenge. Paul tried to step in. Let's be careful here. But Jasmine wasn't backing off. Careful is how things get buried. And I think the American people have had enough of that. The room felt suspended in that way live television sometimes does when you realize you're watching something that will replay over and over in the days ahead. The production crew behind the glass looked frozen in their seats, even though you could tell they were all making frantic notes. You speak about public service, Melania said, leaning forward slightly now, her tone measured but firm. But this is theater. You want attention, not truth. Jasmine tilted her head. If it's theater, then it's one where the audience already bought their tickets. I'm just giving them the scene they didn't expect. Roland let out a short laugh, shaking his head. This is the most tense segment I've seen in months. Paul shot him a look that said, "You're not helping." Jasmine finally placed her palm flat on the folder. A small but deliberate gesture. I'm not here to embarrass anyone, First Lady Trump, but I am here to make sure that every person in this country knows that power doesn't mean privacy when that privacy affects public trust. And if we can't have that conversation here, in front of the people, then where? The public trusts action, not gossip, Melania replied. Then, Jasmine said, keeping her tone even, it's a good thing this isn't gossip. A ripple of murmurs moved through the audience again. You could feel the split between those who believed Jasmine was overstepping and those who were silently cheering her on. Social media was likely already on fire. Hashtags forming in real time, video clips circulating before the segment even ended. Paul checked the clock. 3 minutes until commercial. Too much time to coast, not enough to completely shift the topic. He cleared his throat. All right, Congresswoman, we'll give you the floor for the last minute here, then move on. Jasmine didn't rush. All I'll say right now is this. When leaders think certain details about their lives are too inconvenient to share, it's usually because those details matter more than they want to admit. And when those details connect to public resources, public money, or public image, the public has a right to know. She gave a faint nod toward the camera. And they will know. Melania's lips pressed into a line. She didn't speak, but her silence was almost louder than a rebuttal would have been. Jasmine let the silence stretch just long enough for people at home to shift to the edge of their couches. The camera seemed to lock in on her hand as she finally slid the folder closer. She flipped it open. The movement deliberate, no wasted motion. The studio lights caught the glossy surface of the documents inside. A mix of printed statements, highlighted notations, and what looked unmistakably like flight manifests. Congresswoman, Paul said hesitantly, I'm going to remind you this is a live broadcast. I'm aware, Jasmine said without looking up, which is why I'm only going to present information that's verifiable and already in the possession of oversight committees. Melania kept her eyes forward, though her fingers shifted against each other in her lap. Jasmine lifted the first sheet and placed it on the table between them, angled so both Melania and the cameras could see. These, she began, are travel records from last year. Dates, destinations, and passenger lists, all tied to flights categorized as official but booked through private intermediaries. Roland raised his eyebrows. That's unusual. It's more than unusual, Jasmine replied, flipping to another sheet. On several occasions, these flights list the First Lady as the passenger of record, but the destinations don't match any public schedule released by the White House. Paul tried to cut in. And are you alleging? I'm stating, Jasmine said, her voice firm but calm, that the dates of these trips align with large, unexplained transfers between accounts held by shell companies with connections to individuals currently under federal investigation. The room went still. Even Roland's usual smirk disappeared. Jasmine didn't look away from Melania. Now, I'm not here to accuse you of wrongdoing, but I am here to ask why the spouse of the President of the United States is appearing on travel manifests linked to private entities under scrutiny, and why those trips were never disclosed to the public. Melania's response came after a long pause. I take many trips for my work as First Lady. Some are private, for my own projects. I am entitled to privacy in those matters. Jasmine leaned in, but her voice stayed even. Privacy is one thing. Using taxpayer resources for trips that coincide with suspicious financial activity is another. Paul shifted uncomfortably, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. Congresswoman, we have to be careful about what we imply. I'm not implying, Jasmine said, turning briefly toward him. I'm showing. She slid another page across, this one with highlighted bank transfers. These transactions total over $420,000. Same week, same cities. And in each case, the public was told the First Lady was attending events in entirely different locations. The camera cut to Melania. She was still poised, but there was a stiffness in her jaw now. If you are accusing me of something, say it clearly, Melania said. I'm saying the American people deserve to know why their First Lady's documented movements don't match the official record, and why those movements line up so neatly with private financial activity, Jasmine replied. If there's an innocent explanation, this is your chance to give it. The audience murmured again, louder this time. The tension wasn't just between the women now. It had spread to the entire room. Melania sat back, her voice a shade cooler. I will not play into political theater. My work speaks for itself. If someone wishes to investigate, they are free to waste their time. It's not about wasting time, Jasmine said. It's about protecting public trust. And if leaders want to keep that trust, they can't ask people to accept answers like, it's private, when the truth is sitting in plain sight. Roland leaned forward, clearly caught up in the moment. Well, I don't know about the rest of America, but I think everyone watching just heard one of the most direct challenges ever made to a First Lady on live television. Paul glanced nervously toward the control room. Someone was holding up a note. 1 minute to break. Jasmine closed the folder, but left it on the table. These documents are already in the hands of the Oversight Committee. They'll do their job. But the public deserves to hear this now. Not 6 months from now when it's buried under another headline. Melania adjusted her sleeve again, her eyes flicking briefly toward the camera before returning to Jasmine. History will judge all of us. I have no concerns about mine. Jasmine held her gaze. Then you shouldn't have concerns about transparency either. The moderator's voice came in, almost a relief. We'll be back after the break. The lights dimmed slightly, the music cue rolled, but even as the broadcast faded to commercials, neither Jasmine nor Melania looked away from each other. The break wouldn't cool things down. It would give the audience just enough time to digest what they'd seen and come back wanting even more. When the cameras returned from commercial, the studio felt fundamentally different. The chatter from the live audience during the break had been louder than at any point earlier in the night. A few people had even whispered questions to each other, trying to piece together what Jasmine's evidence might mean. While Melania had remained seated with perfect posture, there was a new tightness around her mouth. A subtle sign to anyone trained in body language that the first crack in the armor had appeared. Paul welcomed viewers back, his tone heavier than before. We're continuing our discussion tonight with First Lady Melania Trump, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, and political analyst Roland Chase. His eyes moved to Jasmine almost reflexively. Congresswoman, you presented some documents before the break. Yes, Jasmine said evenly. Documents that raise legitimate questions about the use of resources and the accuracy of the public record. Melania leaned forward now, just slightly. If you think this is a court, you are mistaken. The American people do not want gossip. They want results. The American people want both truth and results, Jasmine replied without flinching. Without truth, the results are meaningless. Roland chuckled. I have to admit, this is a lot spicier than I expected when I got invited. Paul shot him a warning look before turning to Melania. First Lady Trump, do you want to respond specifically to the alignment of the travel and financial records? Melania's hands clasped together on the table. I have commitments that are not always public. I do not need to explain every detail of my life for political theater. People who know me, they know my work. It was a calm statement on paper, but there was a faint sharpness in her delivery now. Jasmine noticed it. The audience noticed it. And the cameras definitely caught it. I respect your right to privacy in personal matters, Jasmine replied. But this isn't about your personal life. This is about activity that intersects with public trust. Those flights and those transfers weren't paid for out of a personal account. At least not entirely. The audience reacted audibly this time. A mix of gasps and murmurs. Melania's lips pressed together in a thin line. If there is an investigation, I will cooperate. But I will not answer to accusations made for entertainment, she said. I'm not here to entertain anyone, Jasmine responded. I'm here to make sure the people who sent me to Congress know I take my job seriously, even when it's uncomfortable. Roland shifted in his seat, leaning toward Melania. It sounds like the Congresswoman is saying there's more here than just bad optics. Melania turned to him, her voice carrying an edge. And it sounds like you are trying to stir more trouble. My life is not a game. If it's not a game, Paul quickly stepped in, then I trust you'll have no problem clarifying why those trips were routed the way they were, or why the destinations don't match official records. For the first time, Melania hesitated before answering. It wasn't long, maybe a second or two, but it was enough to make the pause itself feel like an answer. I will not give details of every meeting or private engagement. That is my right. That's the problem, Jasmine said quietly. When leaders use that line too often, it stops being about rights and starts being about hiding from accountability. The live audience erupted in a small wave of murmurs. Even the camera operators seemed glued to the exchange, keeping their lenses locked tight on the two women. Melania's accent thickened slightly as she replied, You think you know more than you do, Congresswoman. This will pass. People will forget. Not if the truth matters to them, Jasmine countered. There it was, the shift. Melania's voice had grown harder, her answer shorter. She was still holding the posture of composure, but her tone carried a brittle edge now. Paul cleared his throat, trying to rein things back in. We have more topics to cover, but clearly this one has struck a chord. Yes, Jasmine said without looking away from Melania. Because truth usually does. Roland grinned faintly, shaking his head. I can already see the headlines in the morning. The control room signaled that they still had several minutes left before the next break. Too much time for Melania to retreat. Not enough time for her to fully reset her demeanor. Jasmine seemed to sense it. I'll just say this, Jasmine added, her voice steady but piercing. If leaders want to keep the respect of the public, they can't let silence answer for them. Because silence is only comfortable for the people who have something to lose if the truth comes out. Melania didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced briefly at Paul, as if silently requesting a change of subject. But Paul knew, and everyone in the room knew, that changing the subject now wouldn't erase what had just been said. By the time Paul shifted his attention to Roland, the studio's temperature had moved from tense to volatile. Roland adjusted his glasses, glancing between the two women before speaking. I'll be honest, Paul. I've been on panels where the most exciting thing was a heated argument about infrastructure funding. But tonight, this is different. We're talking about the First Lady's movements and financial patterns being questioned in real time, with documents on the table. That's not a small deal. Paul tried to keep the focus balanced. Roland, Let's remember that these are still unverified by independent media. They're verifiable, Jasmine interrupted, tapping the closed folder with her fingertips. They're already in the hands of oversight officials. This isn't speculation. It's simply earlier than the White House expected the public to hear it. Roland nodded toward her. And that's the kind of thing that makes a story explode faster. You give people a live confrontation, and they'll be talking about it before you even finish the segment. Melania finally cut in, her voice a shade cooler than before. This is not the way to serve the public. These are personal matters being twisted for headlines. Personal matters don't get booked through official travel channels, Jasmine said plainly. And they don't align with public funds unless there's a reason. The audience murmured again. Even those in the studio who weren't political junkies could tell the implications were significant. It wasn't just the accusation. It was the fact that it was happening right there, with no pre-taped edit, no chance to spin it before it reached the public. Paul sighed, looking down at his notes. I want to be clear. Neither the network nor I have verified these records. Jasmine turned toward the camera, addressing viewers directly. And I encourage anyone watching to ask your representatives to review them for themselves. Don't take my word for it. Demand to see the truth with your own eyes. It was the kind of moment that bypassed the usual political filter and spoke directly to the public. And that's exactly what made it dangerous for Melania. Roland chuckled softly. I'd hate to be on the White House communications team tonight. Melania's eyes narrowed at him, but she didn't speak. It was clear she was weighing every word now, careful not to create a headline worse than the one already forming outside the studio. The digital reaction was already building like a wave. Twitter, or X, as the rebranded logo on people's phones now called it, was lighting up. The hashtag Jasmine versus Melania had already begun trending in several major cities. Clips of Jasmine sliding the documents across the table were being reposted with captions like, "This is how you hold power accountable," and "She really brought the receipts." Inside the control room, a young producer named Eric was already getting messages from friends across the country. Is this for real? This feels bigger than a panel show. She just ended her. Back on set, Paul made a last-ditch attempt to steer the conversation toward foreign policy, but Roland wasn't letting go. Paul, with respect, I think the American people are going to be less concerned about trade agreements tonight than they are about whether or not the First Lady's travel records line up with her story. Melania straightened her jacket. I have done my work with dignity and without scandal for years. I will not let political games change that. That's your choice, Jasmine replied. But the public will decide whether they see this as a game or as the truth finally breaking through. The live audience gave a small, scattered applause at that line. Not overwhelming, but noticeable, especially in a room where clapping wasn't the norm during a panel segment. Paul exhaled and tried to summarize the moment. We have one final segment after the break, and I suspect this discussion will continue. As the cameras cut to a wide shot, Melania's expression was unreadable, but her stillness looked less like poise now, and more like a deliberate effort to contain something threatening to spill over. Jasmine, on the other hand, wore the faintest expression of quiet satisfaction. Not smug, not celebratory, just the look of someone who had said what she came to say and knew it had landed exactly where intended. Backstage, crew members whispered about the possibility of network executives calling down to manage the fallout. In the green room, another guest scheduled for the next segment shook his head in disbelief. I don't think we're talking about my topic tonight, he muttered to an assistant. But the real aftershock wasn't in the studio. It was rippling through millions of living rooms and mobile screens across the country, where viewers were deciding whose version of the truth they believed. When the cameras returned for the final stretch of the show, Jasmine appeared as if the last 20 minutes had unfolded exactly according to her blueprint. Her posture remained steady, her breathing unhurried, her eyes focused. If anything, she seemed more composed now than when the broadcast began. Melania, by contrast, maintained the same immaculate appearance, but there was a faint rigidity in her movements, the sort of micro-adjustments you make when you're holding tension in your shoulders. Viewers at home wouldn't need a body language expert to see it. They'd just know something felt different. Paul opened with a softer question, clearly hoping to cool the exchange. Congresswoman Crockett, you've made some strong points tonight. Before we move on, is there anything else you want to say about your position? Yes, Jasmine said without hesitation. I want people to remember that holding leaders accountable isn't disrespectful. It's necessary. The moment we start deciding some people are too important to answer questions, that's the moment democracy begins to erode. She delivered it without raising her voice, but it carried weight. Even the audience stayed quiet, hanging on the words. Melania gave a short reply. I believe in respect. I believe in privacy. This is not about hiding. This is about protecting what is personal. Jasmine nodded slowly. And I believe in truth. And truth doesn't need protection unless it's hiding something. That landed with surgical precision. Roland even muttered a quiet oof under his breath, loud enough for the mics to catch. Paul tried to mediate again. There's clearly a fundamental disagreement here, but let's focus on what the public needs to know moving forward. That's exactly what I'm doing, Jasmine said, leaning forward slightly. This isn't about catching someone in a lie for sport. It's about making sure the public isn't given one version of events while something entirely different is happening behind closed doors, especially when those doors are taxpayer-funded. Melania glanced toward the camera, choosing her words carefully. I have fulfilled my role with dignity. People know me. They will see this for what it is. Jasmine's expression stayed neutral. I think they already are. The panel shifted awkwardly after that. Roland tried to inject some levity, joking about the most intense Sunday night programming in years. But it only made the tension more apparent. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice or escalate. The control she had over the moment came from her calm. The kind that makes the other person seem flustered simply by comparison. When Melania attempted to pivot back to her work on children's literacy, Jasmine let her finish before adding. And that's important work, which is why it deserves to be free from questions about credibility. Because the cause suffers when the person leading it isn't transparent. It was subtle, but it turned Melania's own talking point against her. The audience caught it, some murmuring in acknowledgement. Paul's questions became shorter now, almost perfunctory, as if he knew the rest of the show would be about managing the damage rather than introducing new topics. Melania tried once more to assert control. I am not concerned about political attacks. My life speaks for itself. Jasmine answered instantly. And so do the records. There was no pause, no smile. Just a clean statement that hung in the air like a final verdict. Roland leaned toward his mic. That right there is why this is going to be on every news cycle for the next week. Jasmine glanced at him, then back to Melania. This isn't about the next week. It's about the next election, the next generation, and whether we're teaching them that some people get to live by a different set of rules. Even Paul, who'd been trying all night to keep the tone neutral, had to acknowledge it. That's a fair point, he said, almost reluctantly. Melania gave a small shrug, the gesture elegant but dismissive. People will decide for themselves. They will, Jasmine agreed. And they'll remember who answered and who didn't. It was the kind of closer that didn't need a raised voice or dramatic gesture. It simply stayed with the audience, resonating long after the words were spoken. Jasmine didn't need to push further. She'd already anchored the perception she wanted. That she was the one standing on the side of transparency while Melania was sidestepping. A producer in the control room whispered to the director, "She's won this segment. No question." But the real victory wasn't in the studio. It was in how the next 24 hours would spin the narrative, and Jasmine knew the momentum was already hers. The second the red light on the main camera switched off and Paul's "Thank you for joining us tonight" wrapped the broadcast, the set erupted into a different kind of energy. Producers, stage managers, and crew moved quickly, but not before stealing glances at Jasmine and Melania. It was the same way people look at the scene of a near accident. Half in shock, half in awe that it happened right in front of them. Melania stood first, offering Paul a polite handshake and a faint smile for the benefit of any lingering cameras. But she didn't linger. Two aides in tailored suits flanked her instantly, guiding her toward the side exit of the studio. The walk wasn't rushed, but there was an unmistakable urgency in how they cut through the small clusters of crew. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't move right away. She took her time gathering her notes, slipping the folder into her bag, and thanking the production assistants with a warm nod. If Melania's exit was about control and damage management, Jasmine's was about signaling calm and confidence. The look of someone who knew she just owned a moment that would ripple far beyond the room. By the time she stepped out into the hallway, her phone was already buzzing. Her chief of staff's voice came through before she could say hello. "Twitter's on fire. You're trending in 6 states, and that's just the start. CNN and MSNBC are already clipping the segment. Fox has a panel booked for the morning to fact-check you." Jasmine allowed herself a small laugh. Let them. They'll only repeat the story. Outside the studio, a handful of reporters had gathered, tipped off about potential fireworks. Their questions came fast. "Congresswoman, do you think the First Lady will respond with an official statement? Do you have more documents than the ones you showed tonight? Was this coordinated with anyone else in Congress?" Jasmine gave short, measured answers. Enough to feed the headlines without overselling. "The documents speak for themselves," she said. "And I think the American people deserve to see them." Meanwhile, across the city in the White House Communications Office, the reaction was entirely different. A hastily convened meeting brought together senior aides, press strategists, and legal advisors. The mood was tense, bordering on frantic. One aide slapped a printout of a trending hashtag onto the conference table. "Look where hashtag Melania dodged is trending. It's everywhere. People are connecting dots we haven't even addressed yet." The press secretary shook her head. "We need to kill this before the morning shows. The longer it lingers, the worse it gets." But even as they spoke, the online discourse was already morphing. Instagram stories were circulating screenshots of Jasmine sliding the travel logs across the table with captions like, "She said receipts, and she meant it." TikTok edits paired the moment with dramatic music, amassing hundreds of thousands of views within hours. Cable news channels replayed the segment on a loop. On one network, a panel of commentators dissected Melania's body language, speculating on whether her slight hesitation before answering one question indicated discomfort. On another, conservative hosts framed Jasmine's move as political theater, but admitted it was devastatingly effective television. Even late-night hosts were quick to seize the moment. One teased, "Apparently Sunday night was document drop day, and the First Lady got a surprise cameo." The audience roared, and the clip made its way across social media within minutes. Back in her hotel room, Jasmine sat on the edge of her bed, scrolling through the reaction. Supporters flooded her mentions with praise. Finally, someone with the guts to say it to her face. "This is why I voted for you." Even some political opponents grudgingly acknowledged her skill. "Not my politics, but you can't deny she handled that like a pro." Her chief of staff sent another update. "Morning shows have requested you. 3 networks. One's offering the first slot at 6 a.m. Jasmine replied with a simple, "Let's do it." Across town, Melania was in a private meeting with her husband's senior advisors. Her own communications director briefed her on the online reaction, carefully avoiding the most brutal commentary. "We'll release a statement reaffirming your commitment to your initiatives and dismissing the Congresswoman's claims as unfounded," the director said. Melania listened, her face impassive. "They will forget this," she said finally, though it sounded more like a hope than a certainty. By midnight, major political blogs had posted full transcripts of the exchange. Analysts were already debating the long-term implications. Would it damage the First Lady's credibility? Would it embolden other lawmakers to take similar shots at high-profile figures? Or would the administration's base rally around her as a victim of unfair attacks? One thing was certain. The clip wasn't going away. But for Jasmine, the real win wasn't the trending hashtag. It was that the conversation had shifted, and she'd set the terms. The morning after, Washington, D.C. fell sharper somehow. The kind of day when headlines hit before sunrise and the city wakes up already in debate mode. Jasmine had been up since 5 a.m., sipping black coffee in her hotel suite while watching clips of last night's broadcast on 3 different channels. Each network played it differently. One framed it as a showdown, another as a much-needed reckoning, and one tried to minimize it entirely. But none could erase the images. Her calm delivery, the folder on the table, Melania's tightening expression. Her first stop was a live interview on Morning View, a program known for drawing a politically diverse audience. The host wasted no time. "Congresswoman Crockett, some say you blindsided the First Lady. Others say you did what too many are afraid to do. What's your take?" Jasmine leaned slightly toward the camera, her tone steady. "My take is simple. Public service is about trust, and trust means you answer to the people, even when the questions are uncomfortable." It wasn't a soundbite built for drama. It was meant to feel like common sense. And it landed exactly that way. By midday, the clip of her answer was already circulating alongside last night's confrontation. It had transformed from a single TV segment into a multi-day narrative, and Jasmine was steering it. Later that afternoon, back in her congressional office, she met with a small group of staffers. "I want us to keep the focus where it belongs," she told them. "This isn't about humiliating someone. It's about making a point. No one is above answering to the public." Her chief of staff nodded. "That's resonating. People are calling in, not just from your district, from across the country. They're saying they want more representatives who aren't afraid to speak up." Jasmine smiled faintly. "Then that's the lesson. If you see something wrong, say something. Don't wait for permission, and don't wait for the right moment. The right moment is the one where people are paying attention." That evening, she recorded a short message for her social media channels. Sitting at her desk, dressed in a plain navy blouse, she spoke directly to the camera. "I know last night's segment stirred up a lot of conversation. Some of it was supportive, some of it wasn't, and that's fine. Democracy thrives on debate. But here's what I want people to remember. The truth doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to shout to hold someone accountable. You just need to show up prepared, speak plainly, and keep the focus on what matters. Because in the end, leadership isn't about protecting your image. It's about protecting the trust people put in you." Her words weren't flashy, but they carried the same calm authority that had defined her appearance on the panel. And that was intentional. She wanted her supporters to feel validated, and her critics to have nothing to accuse her of beyond asking questions. The message spread quickly. Advocacy groups clipped her closing line, adding it to their campaigns. Teachers used it in civic lessons about transparency. Even a few political commentators who'd criticized her the night before admitted grudgingly that her framing was effective. Meanwhile, the White House released a short statement from Melania's office. "The First Lady remains committed to her initiatives and will not be distracted by baseless insinuations. She encourages all Americans to focus on solutions that unite us." It was polished, concise, and clearly aimed at turning the page. But in the court of public opinion, the moment had already taken root. That night, as Jasmine walked to her car, a woman in her late 60s stopped her on the sidewalk. "I don't agree with everything you say," the woman admitted. "But you were right to ask those questions. Too many people are scared to." Jasmine thanked her and kept walking, the cool air biting at her cheeks. She thought about the past 24 hours, the cameras, the folder, the wave of reactions, and she knew the political storm would pass eventually. But the principle behind it wouldn't. Somewhere out there, someone who'd never considered speaking up was thinking about it now. And maybe that was the real point. She posted one final message before turning in for the night. Power answers to the people, not the other way around. Keep asking questions. Keep holding leaders accountable. And if you believe in truth over convenience, subscribe and stay engaged. The work isn't over. It wasn't a victory lap. It was an open invitation. Because the lesson wasn't just that Jasmine could win a moment. It was that anyone, anywhere, could win one too if they had the courage to stand their ground.